Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as a supreme authority, or to the governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honour the emperor. Slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. For it is commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because they are conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sin and live for righteousness. By his wounds we have been healed. For you were like sheep going astray, but now you have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls.
Thanks so much, Mel. Well, we're continuing our series looking at work, and we've called the series Workship, how we might find our work as a means of worship. Last week, we looked at the purpose of work, that we were created to do something, to do things with purpose and intent. And we kind of framed that thinking we've been put on this earth to curate creation for God's presence, looking forward to when he comes again. And there's honor and joy and purpose and fulfillment in work, whether that's out on, in the office or out on the field or on a job site or at home with your family, work with children, with teenagers, with adults, with older adults, with paid work or unpaid work, volunteering, working for others, working for ourselves, working for the world, studying, whatever we might be doing, we're doing so that we could cultivate creation for God's presence. Now, work isn't always good. Work always isn't fun. Work actually quite often can be a place of a lot of frustration and challenge and brokenness and corruption. When I used to work as an engineer, and my first job was a graduate process engineer for an oil and gas consultancy, and I was working for an oil and gas consultancy during the oil price drop, where it dropped oil halved in price overnight, and it's like waves and waves of redundancies across the nation. I survived a few rounds of redundancies at my own firm, but I remember one meeting where there was a whole heap of people who were laid off. And the managing director hosted a town hall and gathered all the remaining employees into one meeting room and said, that's it, we're done. We've pivoted, we've shifted to be able to set ourselves up for success in this season, this time. We're finishing making layoffs. We are who we need to be to fulfill our purpose, which is returning maximum profit for our shareholders. And in the season, the time, and the setting, for him to say that, like, yeah, we know that's why we're here. We know that's, why we work. It was to get other people rich. But you don't tell us that. Anyway, the following Friday, another wave of redundancies. They weren't done. And either the leadership was completely incompetent and had to rearrange and everything, or they weren't telling us the truth. Either way, I was still hanging on. I reckon it was my ability to make coffees for everyone in the office is what kept me around for as long as I did. How do I operate with integrity when management's lying to us? How do I live out my faith in this context where people are taking advantage of me? People are cheating and lying. And how do we work with integrity in a broken and corrupt world? Integrity is the idea of being strong and complete and whole, like unbroken in our purpose and calling. And the thing about corruption is that it spreads and breaks things down and compromises our work, our purpose, what we're here for. But we're not steel poles. We're Christians. And Peter, the writer of what Mel wrote before, he writes to scattered Christians all throughout the Asia area who find themselves living out their faith in non-Christian environments, in societies and workplaces and even families that don't know Jesus, that don't know or don't love Jesus, and are actually often quite against Jesus. And so we're going to have a quick look at what Peter has to say into this topic of how do we work with integrity in a broken, corrupt world. And there's so much more to say. And I reckon this is probably one of the sermon that's had the most reshaping, cutting, adding, cutting, moving that I've ever done. But I want to draw out some thoughts from what Peter has to say here on how to live as Christians scattered in non-Christian environments, but really hone in what Jesus has to say to slaves, but particularly how Jesus is the model and the means for how we work with integrity in a broken and corrupt world. So we'll work through the first bit quite quickly, but even just before we get to verse 11, just before that, Peter establishes who we are. He says, you are a chosen people, in verse 9, a chosen people, royal priesthood, holy nation, a people belonging to God, that you might declare the praises of him who are called out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you are not a people, now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, now you have received mercy. He's speaking to our identity. Irrespective of what we do for work, irrespective of whatever context we might find ourselves in, the communities we might find ourselves, the society we might find ourselves in, we are the people of God. We are chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. I love what Dave said in his weekly update a couple of weeks ago the night after the election. Do we vote right, or are we right-wing or left-wing? No, we're up. We're citizens of heaven. That's who we belong to. And so we live that out. We work that out in whatever space we find ourselves in. And so that's what Peter's talking about, is how do we live out our identity as chosen people, as God's holy nation, as God's people. And he has a few instructions, a few guidance for us. The first is that we might be different. We might be different. He says in verse 11, "Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles, as people who are not natives in the world you are in, as foreigners and exiles, to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul." Elsewhere in 2 verse 1, he says, "Rid yourself therefore of all malice, guile, insincerity, lying, envy, and slander." Further on in chapter 4, he says, "Live the rest of your lives no longer by human desires, but by the will of God." You spend enough time doing what the pagans do, living in licentiousness, passions, drunkenness, revels, carousing, and lawless idolatry. Effectively, what Peter's saying is, don't buy into your own desires. Don't live as the world lives, which is living whatever is best for you. Follow your heart. Do what's best for you. Fight for what you want. Peter says, don't do that because that's not who you are. We're called to be different. Don't be caught up in the self-centered, self-directed society, but live differently. We're called out of that. And it's quite hard to do in a society and culture that's so self-centered and self-gratifying and self-serving, to not get caught up in that, in the gossiping, in the pushing others aside so that we can climb up the corporate ladder, in being selfish with our time and resources at work, being annoyed when things aren't convenient for us. We don't live as the world lives. We don't live to fulfill our own desires. We live as God commands, as God wills. The second thing he says is be better, be different, be better. Verse 12, live such good lives among the pagans, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. If verse 11 is the negative sense, verse 12 is the positive spin on that. Live such good lives that people notice. Now, it's not just being polite or courteous to each other, but it's a flip of verse 1. Verse 11, instead of being selfish, instead of fulfilling our own desires, live good lives. Don't be selfish, be selfless. Don't be selfish, be generous and good with those around you. Offer to pay for the coffee run. Being honest with your timesheets even when everyone else is lying. Going out of your way to do such a good job that you make your boss look really good. Spending that extra time with a student who really annoys you. And when you move on from a job, finishing well and working hard right up to the last minute that you're employed. When you get praise, share it. When you get blamed, own it. Doing good so that other people might notice you, might notice Jesus in you. The next thing Peter says is, he says, be subject and respectful. He talks about being subject to society and every human authority. Speaking to those Christians scattered throughout Asia within the Roman Empire, be subject to governing authorities. That's the local authorities, but then also the emperor. And being subject, submitting ourselves doesn't mean blindly obeying, but it means submitting to their authority and respecting it. And when it comes between obeying God or obeying government, we obey God, but we respect the government. Obviously, there's a lot more to say on this, but I think verse 17 is very helpful verse to kind of frame ourselves as we wrestle with how do we live, in our government. How do we honor our government, obey our government? Peter says, show proper respect to everyone, love for the family of believers, fear God, honor the emperor. Whatever that might mean or work itself out. But I wanted to look at particularly what he has to say to slaves, where he says, slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only those who are good and considerate, but also those who are harsh. Now, obviously, Peter never met the bosses I've had. I'm not talking about Mark, who's convenient left. I spent a bit of time. I was made redundant. I was eventually lost my job from my consultancy, but then I was brought back in as a casual, being paid less than I was there as a full-time employee. When you add the casual loading, then it doesn't add up. But anyway, I was called in to work for this particular client who asked for me specifically, and I was kind of like seconded for his company. and one of the tasks I had to do was these weekly cost forecasts. And they were doing exploratory drilling for oil, and it was very high stress, high impact. We had to do these forecasts every week. That I would scope out what's the team, what are the people spending money on this week and in the weeks to come and the months to come. I'd put that all in a spreadsheet. I'd ring around and find out exactly what's happening, and then give that report to my boss, who would then go and present it to the board of directors. One time I made a very small error. So it wasn't entirely my fault. Someone else forgot to mention something, and I missed an expense of about $5,000 in a $200,000 weekly forecast. It's not very much, but I made one small mistake. My boss found it. He picked it. He was pretty sharp. He found it, and he was able to correct it before he went on to the board of directors. But afterwards, he said to me, "You could have humiliated me if I got that wrong. One more mistake like that, and don't bother coming in again." And a couple of weeks later, I made another small mistake. And luckily, I had another job on the line that I was moving on to. Hallelujah, someone said. How do I respect someone like that, who just treats me like a resource, that he only uses me to prop himself up? Now, I want to be really clear that in our workplaces, we are not slaves. We're not slaves in the same way that Peter's talking to slaves. We have rights, we have opportunities, and there's definitely situations and circumstances we have the ability to remove ourselves from that, go and find another job, or quit, or escape an abusive environment. And we should do that in certain circumstances. But Peter's talking to slaves in first century Israel and Asia and that whole area in the Roman Empire. Slaves were kind of the very, very, very bottom of the social ladder. Historians estimate that it was about 20% of the Roman population were slaves, and they served the top 2% of the richest of the population. They did pretty much everything from cleaning the house to farming the land, working in mines, and doing all the dangerous stuff related to that. Whatever their masters told them. They had next to no rights. The only way they could get out of that situation if they were to buy themselves out. But where would they get the money to do that when all the money's going to their masters anyway? They existed completely at the mercy of their master, where there was any or not. They were often beaten, taken advantage of, extorted, treated horribly. Now, we are not in that situation. We're in a lot better off situations. And yet Peter says to them, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters. He says, accept their authority, even if it means suffering. Even if it means suffering. He says in verse 19, it's commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because they are conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? If you suffer for doing good and endure it, this is commendable before God. Effectively, Peter is saying, suffer for the right reasons. It's easy to avoid suffering by taking shortcuts, by cheating, by lying. And if you're punished for that, there's no honor in that suffering. Punishment for doing the wrong thing is a given. But Peter says to these slaves, don't let that be you. You do the right thing. You live differently. Do better. Be good. Submit to the authority. And even if you're punished unjustly for it, keep doing the right thing. Why? Because that's what they're called to. He says to verse 21, to this you were called, to live differently, to experience suffering under unjust, cruel, mean people in a different way to the world. So what we're called, being Christian, being called into the family of God doesn't mean that everything will be fixed. It doesn't mean that life will be great for us now. To be a Christian is not a cushy life, but an obedient life. So when we are being mistreated and ridiculed, passed over, persecuted, undermined, how can we turn around and respect those people, to honor those people, to be generous to those people, to not work like they work, to fight back, to gossip, to slip a rumor about someone, to undermine authority, to make a boss or colleague look bad so that we could look good, to lie, to steal? How do we not live like that? And it's so easy to. Peter says, we look to the model that Jesus gave us. Because Christ suffered for you, leaving an example that you should follow in his steps. You're called to a life of faithfulness in unjust suffering because we follow the example, the model of Jesus. That word example in verse 21, the example, it could be translated model. It's kind of like that classroom idea of a stencil, that Jesus has given us a stencil that we can trace around and write over. We trace his life and do the same. He's walked before us and we follow in his footsteps. So think about Jesus' work situation. What was his workplace like? Jesus, who was at the right hand of God and with God in heaven, gave up that place of privilege and comfort and security and came down and entered into the world. He lived in one of the least respectable towns. His task was far greater than any human being could handle. His team was brash, impulsive, never really understood what he was on about. And when he needed them most, they abandoned him. His audience and his stakeholders, his clients, if you say, they hated his message. Even the experts in the material that talked all about him, they wanted to kill him. And the death Jesus died was the worst possible death to conceive of. As his disciples left him, his own people called out insults and threats as he was beaten. He was ridiculed with a crown of thorns. He carried his own cross, his own tool of execution up a hill. He is nailed to the cross, and there he hangs, slowly suffocating until finally he breathes his last. How did he respond in that situation, under that unjust, cruel treatment? Verse 22 says, he committed no sin, no deceit was found in his mouth. It would have been very easy for Jesus to give up, just to be selfish for a minute and do something for himself, give in to his own desires, call upon the angels to release him, or just do anything to relieve his suffering a little bit, but he doesn't. He never sins, nor does he lie. There was false accusations and lies thrown at him, and he could have lied to get himself out of there, but he didn't. He never lies. Verse 23, when they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. Jesus doesn't retaliate. His disciples who abandoned him, the people who cursed him, the guards that beat him, the Romans who crucified it, Jesus never retaliated to any of them. They deserved it. But instead, Jesus prays for their forgiveness rather than their judgment. Jesus doesn't respond with threats. He doesn't use his position as the Son of God to call down judgment on those around him who are harming him and hurting him in this way. Jesus never wavers in his trust in God. In all of this, he endured this incredible suffering by entrusting himself in the one who judges justly. in all this, Jesus knew what he had to go through. He knew that God had a greater plan. And he knew what was happening in him was so that in time, and as he put his trust in God, God would deliver him. He put his trust in the one who would judge justly. And it was because Jesus endured, because he trusted God completely, because he did not sin or retaliate or lie or threaten, he accomplished what he came to do on the cross. Jesus is a model to follow. As we look at him and we see how he endured unjust suffering, how he endured a toxic workplace, if you put it that way. He gives us a great model, but he's not just a model to follow. He's the means by which we can follow it. Because Jesus accomplished what he came to do on the cross. Verse 24, he says, he himself bore our sins in his body on the cross so that we might die to sin and live for righteousness. By his wounds we have been healed. He took on our failure, our rebellion, all the times we were hurtful, mean, disrespectful, lazy, selfish. Jesus himself took that on himself. He took on that corruption and corrosion of our lives on himself so he could pay for it and he could deal with it so that we wouldn't live under judgment, but we would live in righteousness. He took those sins on himself so that we wouldn't have to, so we'd be free from that. So we're forgiven. And we're given a new life that we can do right. We are free to live a righteous life, a life that reflects the God who put us on this earth. So we don't need to turn back to fulfill our desires and to live like the world lives and to sin and deceive and threaten people and live selfishly, because that's not who we are anymore. So even if we're under a harsh boss or even though the people around us might be sinning and lying and cheating and they're treating us poorly, we don't need to live like that. That might be how the world works, but we are made into something new, something better. We're healed. Through the wounds and the suffering Jesus experienced, he's brought us healing. Not just from the pain and suffering we might experience now through the hope of glory later. But right now we're healed from the curse of sin, from the corruption and corrosion that's working in us. We're healed of that. So that which tore us apart on the inside is taken away and we're healed, both spiritually and relationally. And then verse 21. As we experience unjust suffering or the hardships of work and frustrations and where we feel isolated and alone and broken because of what Jesus accomplished on the cross, he says, for though you were like sheep going astray, now you have returned to the shepherd and the overseer of your soul. Even though at one point we were all like sheep going astray, apart from God, heading down dangerous paths, seeking our own desires and just living foolish lives. Because of what Jesus has accomplished on the cross, we're returned to our Heavenly Father, the shepherd and overseer of our souls, the one who made us and loves us and wants the best for us. We're returned into relationship with God. We're returned home. Because of what Jesus has done on the cross, we're given a new life. We've been healed of our past and our present and our future. We've been given a place with God forever at his home, and we've returned to the God who judges justly, the great shepherd of our soul. And so this is why Peter calls slaves who are in hopeless situations, like we could never imagine, to endure suffering and to live good lives, even in those really hard, corrupt circumstances, because Jesus is their model to follow and the means by which they can live that out. Because their hope is not in the life they might experience now. Their hope isn't their master suddenly turning around, becoming kind again. Their hope isn't the success of the work that they do, the promotion, the whatever. Their hope is in what Jesus has accomplished for them. Our hope is not dependent on our success in our career, but the salvation we receive from Christ, from Jesus. Jesus is the model and the means by which we can live with integrity, we can work with integrity, even in a broken, corrupt world. And there's an impact of this. When people see us living differently, doing good in the world, enduring unjust suffering, that causes curiosity in the world. And so the last B of this sermon, be different, be better, be subject and respectful, be ready. Be ready to answer the question when people come asking. Chapter 3, verse 15, just a little bit further on, Peter says, always be prepared, be ready to give an answer to everyone who asks you, to give the reason of the hope that you have. When I was eventually made redundant, I was given a letter on Monday, and the letter said that your last day is going to be Wednesday. And there was no expectation to come in during that period. But and so no one else came in on the Tuesday, because why would they? But I did. And one of the colleagues there who was staying asked me, "Why are you here today? You've been made redundant. You've got no work here. You've got no purpose of being here." And I said, "Well, I've got all these projects I was working on. I just want to clean them up so they can be handed over, and you know the company can keep working and using what I've done." But he said, "Why? They haven't done anything for you. It's like, hung you out to dry. Why are you here?" And I can't remember exactly what I said, but it was something along the lines of, because I want to make a positive impact on this company like Jesus has made a positive impact on me. And I've had a few other conversations with this guy since then. He worked with me with that other boss. And I remember there's another time where we were on the elevator going down ready to leave for the day. And so he asked me, kind of out of the blue, you're a Christian. You really believe this stuff, don't you? And then I had like 30 seconds to answer that. Again, I can't remember exactly what I said, but it was along the lines of, well, I was bullied as a kid for being Christian, and that made me explore the evidence and determine for myself, is this true or not? And I came to the conclusion that it is true, that Jesus did rise from the dead, that what the Bible has to say about him is reliable and true. Maybe I wasn't as eloquent as I was then, but it stuck with him. I have no idea where this guy is at now. I pray for him. But the reason he asked was because he saw how I worked. And I wonder if we're actually aware of how much people watch us and notice how we might be different, how we might be kind, and how we respond to unjust, unfair, unhelpful circumstances, and the kind of witness and power that can come when we follow the model of Jesus through the means of what he's accomplished for us. So as God's people out there in workplaces, all across the spectrum, at home, work, office, out in the neighborhood, with friends, whatever it is, we understand who we are. We are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, sent into the world to represent Jesus. So we be different. We be different. So be different. Be better. Be respectful. Be subject. Follow the model of Jesus. And know you can do it because of what he has done for you. And be ready to share your faith because that will happen. We're going to finish again with this time tomorrow. We're going to quickly interview someone from within our community about their workplace and how this works out for them. And again, this is an encouragement for all of us to talk to others within the church, to hear about our work, because our work matters to each other. We want to hear about the challenges, the experiences, the stories. Perhaps there's many other stories like what I've shared. But for this next one, we're not going to stream it. So I'm going to say thank you, everyone, for joining us on the live stream. And we'll see you next week. Same time and channel.